You know. Huh? Oh, yeah, there it is. Thank you.
Morning, Mr. Lowenthal. Can you hear me?
Good morning.
We are all present in the hearing room and ready to start at your call.
I'm ready to start. All right, can I? Is Charlie there? Wait, when is he gonna? Get the larger picture. Stack is when. Look,
Mr. Lowenthal, we can start in 5 seconds.
okay.
5, 4, 3.
Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources will come to order. Good morning, everyone. To everyone who is joining us in person and remotely, welcome to the subcommittee. I had really hoped and planned on chairing the subcommittee in person, but yesterday I spent a significant amount of time with a colleague who tested positively for COVID-19 this month. Abundance of caution and wanting to not, if I am contagious, not to spread it off.
Mr. Chair, we're having trouble hearing you with your microphone. It's in and out. I'm not sure what's wrong.
Golly, what can I do about that? Hello? Can you hear me now?
You're very faint.
I'm very bad. I'll make it louder. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. Good morning. Everyone joining us in person and remotely. I planned on being with everyone in the hearing room this morning, but unfortunately yesterday I spent a significant amount of time with.
Mr. Chairman, your microphone is still not working correctly.
Change this. If it's not working correctly, I'm going to change it to this one. Let's see if this one works any better. Give me a second. All right, I'm going to change.
Is he going on his laptop or? Okay.
All right. Let's get this really yellow, I guess. Can you hear me now?
That sounds good.
Much better, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. All right. I'm going to try this again. I'm just getting the hang of this. And so, Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources will come to order. Good morning to everyone for joining us, both in person and remotely. Welcome to the subcommittee. I was really looking forward to being in the subcommittee room this morning with everyone. But yesterday I spent a significant amount of time directly with a colleague who this morning tested positive for COVID-19. So I think out of an abundance of caution and hoping not to be infected myself, and also hoping that I would, and not wanting to potentially pass it on to anyone else, I'm going to do this remotely. First, Ranking Member Stauber, it's great to see you again. Thank you for attending our hearing on offshore wind in Morro Bay. I thought it was a very informative hearing. But the subcommittee today is meeting to hear testimony on Chairman Grijalva's, let me just get rid of that. Wait 1 second, folks. We're going to be talking on Chairman Grijalva's, what do I do with this? All right. All right, can you see me now? All right. So we're meeting today to hear testimony on Chairman Grijalva's Bill HR 8802, which is the Public Lands and Water Climate Leadership Act, of which I'm a co-sponsor. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at the hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designee. This will allow us to hear from the witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedule. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or at the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the hearing notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Members physically present should provide a hard copy for staff to distribute by email. Please note that members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our fully in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems, like I have, should inform the committee staff immediately, which I believe I did. With that, I'm going to begin my opening statement. Earlier this month, my home state of California experienced one of the worst heat waves ever recorded. Over the past year, we've seen devastating floods, which have washed through Appalachia. We've seen massive wildfires rage across the West. We've seen extreme droughts, and which have reduced water levels to dangerous and record-breaking lows. The climate crisis is here, and it poses an existential threat to American life as we know it now. Our economy, our national security, and the health and well-being of all people, wildlife, lands, oceans, and future generations are at stake. Thankfully, under the leadership of the Biden administration, we've made progress over the past 2 years. Earlier in his term, the president set aggressive but necessary emissions reduction targets. To stave off the worst impacts of climate change, we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from 2005 levels by at least half by 2030. We must achieve 100% carbon-free electricity by 2035, and the entire U.S. economy needs to reach net zero emissions by mid-century. Reaching these targets will, without a doubt, necessitate an all-of-government approach. We need to transform our transportation system, a sector, our industries, our buildings, how we produce food, and of course, how we generate electricity. And we're well on our way. Congress has worked with the Biden administration to achieve major policy victories and invest in clean energy, conservation, and environmental justice communities. Just this Congress, we have enacted the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the most significant climate law in U.S. history. The Office of Management and Budget estimates that because of the Inflation Reduction Act's investments, America is on track to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by the year 2030. That's incredible progress, but we still need to implement these laws and reduce our emissions even further. Luckily, our public lands and waters can help. Historically, these lands have accounted for nearly a quarter of all U.S. annual carbon emissions because of the massive amounts of coal, oil, and gas extraction they support. While Democrats on this committee recognize this for the problem and the challenges that it is, we also see the opportunity for our public land and oceans to be part of the solution to climate change. H.R. 8802 requires the Interior Department and the Forest Service to take the next step in combating climate change by aligning our public lands and waters with the Biden administration's ambitious emission reduction goals. Chairman Grijalva's bill prohibits new fossil fuel leasing and permitting until the Interior Secretary demonstrates that emissions from additional oil, gas, and coal development are consistent with the Biden administration's 2030, 2035, and 2050 climate targets. The Department of Interior has a duty to the public to demonstrate whether fossil fuel development on U.S. public lands and waters is undermining the country's climate goals. H.R. 8802 ensures the department lives up to this responsibility. And so that Congress and all Americans can stay informed on the administration's progress, this bill requires DOI and the Forest Service to develop, publish, implement, and regularly update a greenhouse gas emissions reduction strategy. This requirement will result in the development of an energy plan for our public lands that deals with the threat of climate change. For months, my Republican colleagues have called for the Biden administration to develop a comprehensive strategy for our shared energy challenge. This bill would require just that. Our public lands and oceans can and must be a solution to climate change. But right now, they are still a substantial source of carbon pollution. H.R. 8802 advances a long-term approach to managing oil, gas, and coal development over the coming years in a manner that helps us transition towards a clean energy future and stave off climate disaster. I thank Chair Grijalva for introducing this bill, and I am looking forward to today's discussion. With that, I now recognize Ranking Member Stauber for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman Lowenthal. It's hard to believe that this is likely our last Energy and Mineral Resource hearing before November. And again, I want to thank you, Mr. Chair, for inviting me and our staff members a couple of weeks ago to Morro Bay, California, for an insightful hearing on the possibilities of and challenges facing offshore wind. Today, we are holding a legislative hearing on recently introduced legislation that triples down on the Democrat policies that sent energy prices sky high for Americans. In the first hours of this administration, Joe Biden banned oil and gas leasing in our federal waters and killed the Keystone XL pipeline, starting a domino effect that made this past summer the most expensive driving season in memory and now promises a cold, expensive winter. The number of executive orders from on high also set out unrealistic and unachievable emission standards straight out of the playbook of radical anti-American energy groups, where the U.S. is supposed to reduce emissions by more than 50% by 2050. And today, H.R. 8802 literally bans the Forest Service chief and the Interior Secretary from leasing until those arbitrary targets are met. You heard me right. Democrats right here and now are again proposing to ban oil and gas development at a time when energy prices are higher than they've ever been. And demand for energy will rise in both the short and long term. In the short term, Minnesotans are already preparing for a long, cold, and expensive winter. 66% of homes in Minnesota are heated with natural gas furnaces. Home energy prices, and especially natural gas, are way up. And don't take my word for it. Ask anyone from northern Minnesota who's seeing their energy bills skyrocket while the temperatures plummets well below zero. To my Democrat colleagues here, it might be easy to say, hey, just throw on a sweater and turn down the thermostat a degree or two. In my district, affording your energy bill is a quality of life issue. My constituents don't deserve to be punished for heating their homes this winter because congressional Democrats and Joe Biden want to appease their radical anti-American energy base and further choke our domestic oil and gas production. In the long term, the Energy Information Administration estimates that energy demand will increase by 50% by the year 2050. Therefore, Democrats on this committee are moving legislation that further restricts our development when a nonpartisan energy tracking database projects huge spikes in energy demand. Instead, let's take a moment on the subcommittee and acknowledge reality. The United States of America has led the world in reducing emissions, and it's not even close. And we did so with the proliferation of natural gas development for utility scale use. Our emissions, in fact, declined during President Trump's tenure when we became a net exporter of oil and gas. My point here is that we can reduce emissions and produce American energy to meet our needs and keep up a high quality of life. And last, this bill conflicts with the requirements in current law. The bill clearly states that it, quote, shall not preempt or alter other requirements for lease sales and fossil fuel permits, end quote. On the other hand, the Mineral Leasing Act clearly requires onshore quarterly lease sales, and the misnamed Inflation Reduction Act prevents the Department of Interior from issuing new leases for other energy technologies unless recent oil and gas lease sales have been held. This is an unserious bill. Clearly, Democrats need to toss a bone to their most radical anti-American energy supporters after holding their noses and voting with Senator Manchin. So this is what we have today. And it is therefore disappointing to me that renewable industry groups are playing along and offering support for unserious legislation. We do hope to work together with these organizations in the near future on issues like streamlining transmission regulations, but this admittedly is not inspiring. In closing, this administration has set out from day one by executive fiat to ban domestic energy production, and they have succeeded as the administration has leased the fewest acres since World War II. And that's behind me. And what is the result? Skyrocketing energy prices, crippling inflation, and expensive and cold winters. To address these crises, Democrats in Congress introduced legislation codifying these Biden failures into law. I therefore look forward to exposing this for what it is, this hearing, and I look forward to the witness testimony. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Stauber. Now I'm going to introduce today's witnesses. Dr. Andrew Dessler is a professor of atmospheric sciences and the director of the Texas Center for Climate Studies at Texas A&M University. I'm going to now yield to Congresswoman Peltola to introduce our next witness.
Thank you, Mr. Subcommittee Chair Lowenthal. Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to introduce one of Alaska's community leaders. This is just my 7th day on the job, and I'm finding my calendar has 25 hours of meetings and events stuffed into a 24-hour day. I am so sorry for appearing before you and your committee by video today. As the subcommittee hears HR 8802, the Public Lands and Waters Climate Leadership Act of 2022, you will hear heartfelt testimony from Rosemary Atunguruk, the mayor of Nuiqsut, a community of about 500 people. Mayor Atunguruk cares deeply about everyone in the community, their culture, their access to traditional subsistence foods, and most certainly their health. She's a graduate of the University of Washington Physician Assistant Program and received an honorary doctorate from Oberlin College in recognition of her work addressing health impacts within her community from development. She also shares her knowledge far beyond Nuiqsut and the state by serving on the Environmental Protection Agency's Clean Air Act Advisory Committee. And while the mayor and I may disagree on some issues of oil and gas development in the area, I wholeheartedly agree with her commitment to protecting her people, the lands and the wildlife so essential to Nuiqsut, as does the oil and gas industry that operates on Alaska's North Slope. I believe we can do both, protecting our communities while responsibly producing the oil that is so important to our state and so important to the nation, including the proposed Willow Project. Nuiqsut is about 18 miles south of the Colville River headwaters at the Beaufort Sea. The river delta has traditionally been a gathering and trading place for the Inupiaq people and a productive source for subsistence hunting and fishing. Knowing how important subsistence foods are to the residents, I thank the mayor for her dedication to ensuring the healthy life of her community. I'm honored to have been able to introduce Mayor Atunguruk today, and I look forward to working with her in the future and with the subcommittee to ensure Alaska communities can prosper safely, as they have done for generations, and I expect that they will continue to do for generations to come. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congresswoman Peltola. Our third witness is Ms. Abigail Ross Hopper, the President and CEO of the Solar Energy Industries Association. And our fourth witness will be Mr. Kenny Stein, who is the Policy Director for the Institute for Energy Research. Let me remind the witnesses that under committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will begin, and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining. But we will have your entire statement, as I said, will appear in the hearing record. I recommend that members and witnesses joining remotely use the grid view so that they may pin the timer on their screen. After your testimony is complete, Please remember to mute yourself, which I frequently forget to do, to avoid any inadvertent background noise. I will allow the entire panel to testify before any questioning of the witnesses. I now call upon Dr. Dessler for 5 minutes of testimony.
Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Stauber, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the threat of climate change with you. My name is Andrew Dessler, and I am a professor of atmospheric sciences and the director of the Texas Center for Climate Studies at Texas A&M University, located in beautiful College Station, Texas. Let me begin with the scientific basis for climate change. First, the climate is warming. Second, the scientific community's best estimate is that all of this warming is caused by human activities, mainly the combustion of fossil fuels. Third, we are on track to warm the planet in 2100 by about 5 degrees Fahrenheit above the Earth's temperature in the 19th century. For the global average, this is a huge amount of warming. Although you may personally experience much larger temperature changes over a day or over the seasons, these large local variations you experience cancel with opposite variations in other parts of the world. As a result, the global average temperature is very stable. To put 5 degrees Fahrenheit of global average warming into context, realize that the warming that transitioned us out of the last ice age and into our present warm interglacial period was about 10 degrees Fahrenheit. In other words, a 10-degree Fahrenheit change in global average temperature is the difference between a world covered by ice and today's world. Thus, predicted warming of 5 degrees is half of an ice age. This should compel our attention. It may be enough to significantly remake the surface of the planet. In fact, 2 degrees of warming that we have already experienced over the past 150 years is already turbocharging severe weather events and turning them into catastrophes. Examples include extreme precipitation events such as Hurricane Harvey, the 2021 Pacific Northwest heat wave, and the ongoing aridification of the U.S. Southwest. To be clear, climate change does not, in and of itself, cause these events. However, a new field of science, extreme event attribution, allows us to determine that climate change is making many of these events more severe and destructive than they otherwise would be. And we can be certain that the worst is yet to come. In the nonlinear world in which we live, every bit of warming produces more damage than the previous bit. Your intuition should confirm this. In a rain event, the first inch of rain typically does not cause any damage. However, the 20th inch of rain can be very destructive. If climate change adds a 21st inch of rain, that could turn a severe event into a catastrophe. To the extent that we don't reduce emissions to avoid future climate change, we must adapt to the changing climate. No one really knows how expensive this will be. Economists are split on whether this will cost a few percent of GDP, something that may not be too burdensome, or wipe out much of our wealth. One thing is abundantly clear, though. Most of the world's inhabitants do not have the resources to address the impacts of extreme weather, even today. For example, if warming temperatures require us to air condition large swaths of the U.S. that did not previously require it, who's going to pay for that? Installing air conditioning can cost thousands of dollars, and many people simply do not have spare resources to do that. Luckily, we have the capability to avoid much of the projected warming. The price of climate-safe wind and solar energy has been dropping rapidly over the past decade. Solar has dropped 90%, and onshore wind has dropped 70%, and batteries are presently experiencing similar price drops. Because of this, the U.S. can largely build a carbon-free grid by the mid-2030s that produces power at prices lower than we pay today. I should note that fossil fuels have other problems besides climate change. Air pollution from fossil fuels kills millions of people every year around the world. And I know many of the members of this committee are concerned about energy security. Let me be clear, fossil fuels are bad for our national security. Oil and natural gas are globally priced commodities. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, the price of natural gas spiked here in the U.S., despite the U.S. being a major exporter of natural gas. This is an example of why we will never be able to drill our way to energy security. As long as we rely on globally priced fossil fuels, we will be subject to political machinations of countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia.
It is therefore fortunate that we can economically transition away from fossil fuels today. In conclusion, we are on the brink of potentially calamitous climate impacts. However, we also have the tools to solve the problem. The only question is which of these paths we will choose. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dessler. Dr. Atungaruk, you are recognized for 5 minutes, and I hope I pronounced your name correctly. All right, Dr. Atungaruk is having technical problems, and we will return to her right after our next witness. And now we're going to hear from Ms. Hopper. You're recognized for 5 minutes of testimony. Welcome to the.
Thank you so much. Good morning, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Stauber, and the members of the subcommittee. I really appreciate you inviting me here to discuss the important issues around renewable energy deployment on public lands. I'm actually in California right now at our largest annual conference. I heard this morning there's over 26,000 of us here talking about solar and storage. So this is a timely point for the discussion. My name is Abigail Ross Hopper. I'm the president and CEO of the Solar Energy Industries Association, or SEIA. We are the National Trade Association for Solar Energy and Energy Storage, comprised of over 1,000 member companies representing all parts of the solar and storage supply chain, from manufacturers to installers. With the recent passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, the solar and storage industry will lead the way in combating the climate crisis. Increasing solar and energy storage deployment throughout the nation is vital, and public lands under the jurisdiction of this subcommittee are important resources to help our country reach the goal of a carbon pollution-free power sector by 2035. SEIA has long advocated for improving federal land management policies to improve strategic siting and permitting for solar and storage projects. With the right policies in place, public lands can be used to help create jobs, meet energy needs, and reduce emissions. 25 gigawatts of solar on public lands by 2025. That's just 3 years from now. Meeting this goal is essential to achieve the deployment necessary to reduce carbon emissions and meet our country's energy needs. Work is ongoing to reassess federal land that can be developed for solar and energy storage, and update staffing and policies around competitive bidding and rental rates that are necessary to provide solar developers the business certainty needed to invest in projects on federal land. And this work is well worth it. Supporting more solar and storage development on U.S. public lands will generate enormous economic, employment, and health benefits for local communities, states, and the entire nation. However, progress is slow, and it will take an all-hands-on-deck, multi-jurisdictional approach to improve. Since 2010, BLM has fully permitted 18 solar PV facilities, 100 megawatts or greater in capacity, including over 1,500 megawatts of capacity since January 2021 alone. There are 4.9 gigawatts of projects under development on BLM lands, representing around 7% of the known utility-scale project pipeline, a substantial increase in recent years. Together, these figures tell an incredible story. Solar development on BLM lands is increasing, and permitting timelines are shrinking, likely leading to additional federal development planning. And it should be noted that these figures represent a snapshot in time prior to the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. The biggest obstacle to building solar on public lands is a lack of approved areas for leasing, not necessarily permitting timelines or environmental reviews. Of the other 1,500 megawatts permitted since January of 2021, over half are located on lands outside of the solar energy zones. There's a clear policy lesson to be drawn here. Permitting agencies should continue to focus on opening up additional federal lands to solar development. We believe the Public Lands and Waters Climate Leadership Act will advance this priority, and we urge policymakers to immediately expand the universe of federal lands available for solar leasing in order to harness the full potential of the Inflation Reduction Act. Accessibility of solar and storage for all Americans is of paramount importance to our industry. Right now, 250,000 Americans work in our industry. Over the next decade, solar and storage jobs will grow to over 538,000 Americans by 2032, and that will reflect the diversity and talent of our country in high-quality, clean energy jobs in every congressional district. Investing in education and job opportunities for growing industries like solar can help spur economic growth in communities across the country, including those impacted by a federal presence. Solar and energy storage is poised to grow exponentially over the next decade. To meet the president's climate goals, coordination across the federal agencies and strategic use of public lands can bring jobs and economic development to federally impacted communities. I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hopper. I'm now going to return to Dr. Atungaruk. You're recognized for 5 minutes. I hope that the connection is better now.
Community. I've submitted my written testimony.
Move on. Dr. Atungaruk, can you hear me?
Hello, can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you. I'm going to recognize
All
you
right.
now. 5 minutes of testimony. Welcome to the subcommittee.
Thank you. I'm not sure how long my connection will last. I have submitted written testimony. This is a very important issue for our community. We work in this process tremendously, and as you all are having technical difficulty, our whole process was like this. Trying to participate in commenting and participate in webinars. Bandwidth issues are a real issue. Trying to look at documents as they change over time and provide effective response to what others think may be the answers that are needed for our area don't always come out to be answers that we feel are answers that are necessary. I worked really hard in looking at all the recommendations for required operating procedures, for all the issues around the recommendation and changes. But for this project and the importance of survivability for my community, it's in the wrong location. It's in an area where we already have lots of oil and gas development, but the geological features in this area are very important for the northern migration and for the southern migration. Putting this large development with future development activities continuing to occur in this area puts my community at risk. The northern migration, we need the animals to come around this area and to get around the lake to come back to us. The southern migration, that small area of land on the northeast corner of Chesapeake Lake, is when the animals are coming back to us in very good prime condition when we really need to harvest and provide for our families. Throughout this process, we had to comment during our heightened subsistence activities. We worked really hard because this area is so vital to our community. And even though it impacted us tremendously, we had to make decisions. Are we going to feed our family this year? Or are we going to watch the changes that come and threaten the years to come? These were difficult decisions, but nothing was more difficult than the times that we faced watching what happened with the CD1 gas leak. Having community members coming to me and asking me questions when I could not get answers throughout the process was very difficult. Having family members look at me with their newborn baby asking, should I protect my child now? Can we wait for information to see if we're going to be okay, or should I leave right now? Do I need to protect my pregnant wife in order to make sure our future generations are strong? Do I need to leave now? Many people made decisions to leave immediately without waiting for the report because they were very concerned during the process in the ways that answers were not being given, the way that statements were given in a unified fashion without responding to our issues and concerns. The biggest concerns we faced were, what does this mean for our future? The rapidity of the oil and gas development with the year-round drilling changed this area tremendously. Is it that rapidity of drilling that caused the instability of the site that led to the CD1 gas leak? Is it an instability created over many wells because the cracks on that pad were over many, many wells, not just one? Is this an assurance that we've had an evaluation that looked at what happened, why did it happen, and how are we going to prevent it? Because the presentations we had during the calls said that it was a routine occurrence. But we had to ask those questions. Is this like the Deepwater Horizon? Is this going to be like the process with the village in Bhopal where they didn't wake up overnight? Our community felt the effects from the CD1 gas leak. It's just 8 miles away. We had community members who could feel the change in the air. Family members had difficulty breathing. People had headache and nausea. Some people chose to leave. We watched industry load their buses and move away from us and not respond to our phone calls as we were trying to assess what was happening and why the evacuation was occurring. Just to have them backpedal in their statements and saying that it wasn't an evacuation. Though we had community council members who were at the site when the alarms went off and told us that we had to leave the area and told people at the site that they're evacuating. Our community is important. The importance of our life, health, and safety is why I keep trying in these meetings. The difficulties we face are only becoming amplified.
Dr.
In this process I provided
Doctor, can you
testimony.
Can you please wrap it up? And your full testimony will be in the record.
The concerns for our life, health, and safety, I provided health concerns, a whole testimony of all the different health questions that I've faced over a period of time in working with the NPRA. We don't want this to be our future. We want to be able to live our way of life into the future as our elders taught us from our lands and waters. We thank everyone for giving us this time to communicate, and we provided testimony in the maps that are there. It's important to us, and we thank you for giving us this time.
Thank you, Dr. Atungaruk. Now, Mr. Stein, you're recognized for 5 minutes of question. Of testimony, not question.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to testify at this hearing. My name is Kenny Stein. I'm the Policy Director for the Institute for Energy Research. At the outset, I'd commend the committee for recognizing that this new legislation is needed to change how the Department of Interior manages federal lands. The Biden administration executive actions attempting to halt or reduce leasing and otherwise restricting multiple use on federal lands are contrary to statute. In order for the department to make these sweeping changes, Congress must first change the department's mandate, as this legislation would. Absent such legislation, though, Interior must immediately cease its illegal efforts to restrict leasing and development on federal lands. That said, the approach taken by this legislation would harm our national security by making America more dependent on imports, damage our economy and drive up already high energy prices, and completely overturn the long-standing principles of multiple use which have historically guided federal land management. Before getting to specific energy implications, I will also highlight the most important and most damaging element of this legislation, and I think the implications of which have not actually been fully thought through. In Section 2, the legislation would change the guiding principle of federal land management from multiple use to a standard that, quote, public lands should be managed to rapidly reduce greenhouse gas emissions and co-pollutant emissions, end quote. It is difficult to understate the radicalness of such a mandate. Greenhouse gases are byproducts of human activity, all human activity. A mandate to rapidly reduce greenhouse gas emissions on federal lands is a mandate to rapidly reduce all human activity on federal lands. To take just a few examples, there are substantial emissions involved in tourists visiting our national parks and other federal lands for recreation. This mandate would thus require reducing public access to national parks and federal lands. There are greenhouse gas emissions associated with, say, constructing a solar generation facility, cutting down trees, pouring cement, heavy machinery that runs on diesel, and so on. My fellow witness today from SEIA was probably concerned to hear that this legislation's mandate would be used to prevent solar installations on federal land. What about a community located on or surrounded by federal lands which wishes to build a new road, expand an airstrip, or even just construct a few new buildings? All of those actions involve greenhouse gas emissions. Our witness today, who represents one of those communities, should be concerned about the implications of this sort of mandate on their community's ability to build and maintain basic infrastructure. If any of these examples sound extreme, just look at the use and abuse of the National Environmental Policy Act. And NEPA only calls for rather anodyne consideration of environmental impacts. This mandate affirmatively orders Interior to reduce emissions by any means necessary and no matter the cost. In the hands of extreme environmentalist litigants, this legislation would halt not just oil, gas, and coal leasing, which are the ostensible target, it would halt virtually all activity of any kind on federal lands. Turning from perhaps those unintended consequences to the intended, this legislation is essentially licensed to halt production of conventional fuels on federal lands. While there is an ideological fixation in the environmental community on halting the use of coal, oil, and natural gas, halting leasing on federal lands does nothing to advance that cause. The economic demand for those resources still exists, and it will have to be met from production elsewhere, whether state and private lands or imported from foreign countries. Reducing or ending energy production on federal lands would, however, undermine American national security. While the world, and especially Europe, we have seen them struggling with an energy crisis for much of the last year, the United States has largely been spared the kind of pain that they're going through. But that is because of the strength of our domestic energy production. Oil production on federal lands accounts for about 25% of U.S. production. The federal share of natural gas production has fallen somewhat in recent years, but it still exceeds 10% of total production. And that production is the reason that the United States is not facing shuttered industries and winter gas shortages like Europe is facing. Reducing domestic oil and gas production would actually be worse for the environment overall. Domestic demand for the fuels like oil and natural gas, which the EIA forecasts to continue to provide the majority of American energy needs even in 2050, will have to be met by imports. But U.S. oil and gas production is cleaner and safer than virtually anywhere else in the world by any measure. This legislation might allow someone to pat themselves on the back for getting the federal greenhouse gas emissions tally down a bit, but if your concern is greenhouse gas emissions, it is global emissions that matter. Substituting imports for domestic production would end up increasing overall in international global greenhouse gas emissions. The economic consequences of this legislation can also not be ignored. Revenues from federal energy production are crucial for states and communities across the western United States, supporting government services like schools and hospitals. Jobs like a solar panel installer or a backcountry hiking guide are no replacement for high-paying, skilled jobs in the energy sector. For the wider economy, energy prices are already a key driver of inflation, both in ways we see clearly, like the price at the pump, and ways which are more hidden. Restricting supply at a time when global supplies are already tight will only make energy more expensive. This legislation will cost jobs, increase inflation, reduce government revenues, increase imports, weaken national security, and restrict access to use of federal lands by the public. It's all pain and no gain and should be rejected by Congress.
Thank you, Mr. Stein. I want to thank the panel for their testimony, and I want to remind the members that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. I'm going to start by recognizing Representative DeGette for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for your comity and recognizing me now. I've got another meeting I've got to go to. Dr. Dessler, I really appreciated what you said in terms of I mean, not only do we need to get to energy independence and renewables because we need to do it for the existential threat of climate change, but also we need to do it for economic reasons to get independent of our international oil and gas market, which causes things like the big gas price spikes that we saw this summer. For the last year, a lot of us on this committee have been forced to sit week after week and listen to our Republican colleagues assail the solar industry over importing solar products from countries with poor labor and environmental processes, as if we support poor labor and environmental processes, which is not true. And this is why, Ms. Hopper, I'm so glad you're here joining us today from California to talk to us about this, because I just wanted to ask you about the industry's response and positions on what we can do to keep that from happening. So I want to ask you if the solar industry supports swift and robust implementation of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and other actions to block the importation of products made with forced labor.
Congresswoman, thank you so much for that question. The answer is unequivocally yes. We support quick and swift implementation of the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act. We have acted expeditiously in our industry and in our association. First of all, to make clear that unethical labor practices, forced labor practices, any of those sorts of things are not a part. We do not want them to be a part of the solar supply chain. So we have taken specific steps to change our supply chain. We have created a traceability protocol that our companies are utilizing to be able to trace where products are coming from all the way back down the supply chain. We have worked very closely with Customs and Border Protection to ensure that they have the information they need to validate where our products are coming from. And one of the most important pieces is the action that this Congress took under the Inflation Reduction Act to help bring domestic manufacturing back to the United States. And so that we have a much clearer view of where our products are coming from, inputs are, and in addition, provides lots of economic opportunities. So this is an issue that we are very focused on, and we look forward to continue to work closely with you on that. Thank you.
And I want to tell you, Ms. Hopper, that in Congress, we also believe, and that's why we passed this bill, that we should be producing and processing more of the raw materials for our solar technologies. And also, I think you would agree, there are other countries who are our international allies who have strong labor and enforcement laws that we could also partner with. Do you also support that in your industry?
Absolutely. We have very well-established, trusted trading relationships with many countries around the world that have similar values as ours around labor and environmental standards. And we should be important, that's part of the supply chain.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And I think I'll leave my next line of questioning for someone else, but I want to thank you for having this important hearing. I want to thank Chairman Grijalva for his vision with this committee in having these types of legislation, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative DeGette. I now call upon and recognize Representative Stauber for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Dr. Atangu, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Did you write your testimony?
Yes, I did.
It appears from my end that the file's author is actually a Bridget Sarianosi. Does this person work in an official capacity for your city?
I've worked with many different people over the last 30 years, various relationships over many years. Depending on who you've got this email.
Dr.
I
Ataruk,
believe the doctor, we're losing contact with the doctor.
Is he still on, Mr. Chair?
I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Now we can hear her.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to reclaim whatever time was lost in the.
Absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely.
Thank you. So, Dr. Atenrook, it appears that Bridget Saranosi wrote this. Does she work in official capacity for your city? I don't mean to fluster you here.
No.
She doesn't?
No, I work with many different people over 30 years or so in this process, and she's with previous relationships.
Dr. Atenrook, I have a document properties from your testimony that says the author is actually of your testimony today that you said that you wrote was from from Bridget Saranosi. So it appears that Ms. Saranosi works for a trustee for Alaska, an environmental group actively participating in a lawsuit seeking to kill the Willow Project. In fact, she was quoted recently in a Washington Post article saying, quote, "My hope is that Willow dies a death by 1,000 cuts," end quote. That is her quote. Mr. Chair, I'd like to submit for the record 36 letters of support for the Willow Project from Alaska Natives, labor groups, trade associations, and elected representatives. The most recent one is dated September 16th, 2022, that has all federal elected representatives out of Alaska supporting the Willow Project. Mr. Stein, thank you so much for joining us today. Your testimony discusses how this bill shifts away from the longstanding principles of multiple use on our federal lands to a single closed-minded approach. Could you provide a brief background on the importance of a true multiple use mandate contrasted with a new short-sighted approach like the one in this bill?
Sure. So multiple use is a lot like what it sounds like. It's that public lands are supposed to be available to the use of the public in multiple different ways. And that means certainly recreation, hiking, biking. It also means resource extraction, timber, mining, oil and gas, and wind and solar generation. The idea is that these are public lands and they are available for the use of the public. This legislation changes that mandate and would effectively override that multiple use because, as I said in my testimony, greenhouse gases are a side effect of all human activity. So any human access onto federal lands, virtually any human access onto federal lands, is going to generate greenhouse gas emissions and would thus be contrary to this new mandate.
H.R. 8802 would halt all new leasing of coal, oil, gas, and fossil fuel infrastructure on federal lands until the Secretary develops a, quote, public report and action plan, end quote. Could you discuss how this plan will simply create more litigation and get the anti-American energy activists, lawyers paid?
Well, sure. This is like as I mentioned, the NEPA process. This is basically adding a new NEPA process because the Interior is going to spend an extended period of time coming up with this program. Then everyone's going to sue to say there's problems with the program, and that's going to have to go through litigation. And we'll be 10 years from now, we'll still be trying to get our first program set up in the first place. And during that entire time, oil and gas leasing will be halted.
Thank you. Just for your information, there's a mine in Minnesota that has been going through the process. We're working on pushing 20 years now, so I understand. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Stauber. I now recognize Representative Dingell for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal, for holding today's hearing. It's a very important issue. Thanks to the Biden administration, we're on a path to significantly and meaningful cutting our carbon emissions and achieving a net zero clean economy by 2050. This includes making a transformational shift in the transportation sector to electrification, which is very important. But our public lands and oceans have a role to play as well in the fight against climate change. And that's why this hearing today is so important. I'd like to start with Ms. Hopper to discuss the challenges of working on public lands as it relates to solar projects and how we can improve the permitting process. Ms. Hopper, what are some unique challenges of working on public lands, and what steps has the Biden administration taken so far to reduce these challenges?
Good morning. Thank you for that question, Congresswoman. Some of the unique challenges of working on public lands are sort of the interagency aspect of it, right? That there are often numerous entities that are involved in the permitting. And so sometimes there isn't always as clear communication or timelines, which obviously impact the attractiveness of the project to developers. There are rental rates that have historically been changed and most recently were lowered by the Biden administration. That has been a very welcome development. During the Biden administration, I think I mentioned in my testimony, the BLM has permitted 1,500 megawatts on public lands. That is as a result of some of the expedited permitting processes, but anything that this administration or this bill can do to both increase interagency collaboration and make more public lands available will be helpful.
So I'm going to combine two questions because I want to try to get several questions in and one with another witness. What more can we as a Congress and the administration do to improve the permitting process for solar energy products? And you have experience, as we know, as the Director of Ocean Energy Management. Can you speak to the importance of fully staffed and resourced federal agencies that oversee and permit clean energy?
Absolutely. It is critical, regardless of the energy source, that the agencies have the staff and the expertise they need to do the work that we have entrusted them with. So fully funding the office, the BLM Renewable Energy Office, other agencies is critical to allowing an expeditious permitting process to go forward. Additional things that this Congress can do is to really instruct the Bureau of Land Management in particular and U.S. Forest Service to make more land available for solar and storage development. Those two things will go a long way to expediting the process.
Thank you. Dr. Dessler, as a climate scientist, what's your view on the Inflation Reduction Act? And do you think its implementation is critical to the U.S. achieving its climate targets in the coming years? And I bet we're not going to be able to hear him.
Yeah, so I think that, the U.S. has a stated target of reducing emissions 50% by 2030 and go to net zero by 2050. That's what the Biden administration has said the target is. I think the Inflation Reduction Act is crucial for achieving those targets. While the cost of wind and solar are now the cheapest energy sources, we're still not transitioning fast enough. The market's not moving fast enough for various systemic reasons like transmission availability and permitting and things like that, that you need to have policy like the Inflation Reduction Act in order to hit the targets that the Biden administration has set.
Would any of you like to comment about access to public lands and how we increase accessibility to minerals that we're going to need to lessen our dependence on China at 80% and bring that home to this country? Dr. Adam. I may ask you all some more. Were you going to say something, Doctor? No. I'm going to submit some more questions for the record. Go ahead.
This is Rosemary, and there are very important issues to discuss, but not all of our special areas should be sacrificed for the needs for energy. We need to work together on identifying areas where we need to work on these issues to obtain the resources to allow us to make these changes in the needs for energy development.
And protect the environment and communities at the same time. It's a challenge, but we can have economic security, national security, and environmental security. They're not exclusive, and that's what we all have to work to do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Dingell. I now recognize Representative Graves for 5 minutes of questions. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the recognition and the hearing. This is, once again, another piece of legislation that completely ignores facts, it ignores science, it ignores data. It just comes in just with a sledgehammer and says, we are going to take all of our public lands and put them off limits to energy production, whenever the Biden administration's projections show that you're going to have a 50% growth in global energy demand in the next 28 years. It weakens NATO because our European friends, our NATO allies in Europe, they need additional conventional energy sources. And in some cases, still getting it from Russia, funding the war that they're then funding Ukraine to try and repel. Every action that this administration has taken virtually has added up and resulted in greater greenhouse gas emissions, not lower, but greater. And so to see the chairman once again come in and completely ignoring facts, science, data, reality that indicates that by producing American energy, you actually result in lower global greenhouse gas emissions. I'm curious, Mr. Stein, when you take options off the table like this, do you see a requisite reduction in demand for energy?
Well, no, and that's precisely the point. These sources are going to be used. The ranking member mentioned heating homes in Minnesota. That's not an option, and you need natural gas to do that. So it's going to have to come from somewhere, and if it's not produced here, that has to be replaced by imports. And again, there's much lower environmental standards around the world than in the United States.
Lower environmental standards, for example, in the offshore Gulf of Mexico, some of the least carbon-intensive barrels and cubic feet of energy in the world. Yet we're watching this administration go out and ask Venezuela, ask Iran and other countries for energy. Those countries have higher emissions than the United States, and as you indicated, lower environmental or safety standards. So what happens with global greenhouse gas emissions when you do that?
Well, if you're replacing the American sources that generally are, as you said, are lower emissions than most places where oil and gas are produced, then ultimately, domestically, it might look like we've lowered our greenhouse gas emissions, but on a global level, emissions actually will likely end up higher because, again, in places like Venezuela or Nigeria, the natural gas is basically all vented and flared. It's not used at all. Whereas in the United States, we capture more than 90% of our natural gas that comes up with oil.
So and of course I'm asking a question that I know the answer to, but is this strategy going to result in stabilizing the climate in the United States, but then causing climate problems in other countries, or is that not how it works?
Well, climate change is a global effect, and so any changes are global. So just because we lower our emissions here, that doesn't mean that it changes the impact of climate change on the United States.
So once again, a science uninformed bill that once again the committee is putting forth. This plays into the hands of other countries that are largely adversaries of the United States. So you failed that one by giving them benefits. You failed on the environmental front because this is going to result in greater greenhouse gas emissions. Mr. Stein, another question. What happens to the U.S. trade deficit whenever you shut down domestic energy production opportunities and become more dependent upon foreign sources?
Well, that's the great irony, is that 20 years ago, we were very concerned about our dependence on foreign oil, and it's domestic production that has made us not concerned about that.
So this would increase the trade deficit, meaning that we would be taking something we're currently producing in the United States and exporting, and we would become more dependent upon foreign sources that, by the way, are dirtier. So less economic activity in the United States, handing over our dollars to other countries that are unfriendly, eliminating jobs in the United States and creating job opportunities in other countries that aren't friends of the United States. Is there any upside to this?
Certainly not that I see.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Great, thank you, appreciate it. Yield back.
Thank you, Representative Graves. Has Representative Huffman returned to the?
I'm in the committee room, Mr. Chairman.
Well, then I'm going to recognize you for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, it is pretty rich to hear colleagues across the aisle criticize this bill for not respecting science and data, when in fact all of the science relating to our climate tells us we've got a crisis. The overwhelming consensus of the best scientists in the world is that we have a climate crisis. It is driven by primarily the burning of fossil fuels. And we've got this decade to fundamentally change course, or else we may well have an unlivable planet. That's what science and data tells us. So to turn around and claim that taking action in the face of that crisis somehow doesn't jive with the science and data is just not a credible position. But you know, an interesting thing has happened in Republican messaging on climate. The climate crisis has gotten so obvious. The typhoon in western Alaska is just the latest. And any given week, any given day, this planet is telling us that all of the climate models, all of the warnings we've been receiving for decades are real, they're correct, and in fact, these impacts are accelerating, and it's something we just are past due to grapple with. But Republicans can't deny all that outright anymore. It's just become too obvious to anyone who's paying attention. And so what they do is they just attack any attempt to take action on it. They come up with excuses and tortured arguments. We heard incredible exaggeration from Mr. Stein, taking a policy in this bill that would simply require that we manage public lands and our outer continental shelf to reduce greenhouse gases, and extrapolating from that we're going to literally shut down all activity on public land. That's preposterous. Suggesting that these actions somehow will be worse for the environment than a business as usual status quo where we are contributing to this climate crisis and wrecking public lands with fossil fuel developments in the worst possible ways. These are just not serious arguments, and it's too bad that we have to even respond to them. But let me, before I turn to Ms. Hopper with a specific question, let me thank Chair Grijalva for this bill. It's a good piece of legislation. I'm proud to be co-sponsoring it. It is, I think, a necessary response to the Inflation Reduction Act, which sets some important policies in place to move toward clean energy, but also saddles us with some business as usual fossil fuel leasing that is hard to reconcile with our climate goals. This bill puts in place a process that will kind of force that reconciliation, and I think it's a very good follow-on to the Inflation Reduction Act. But Ms. Hopper, on behalf of the solar industry, you probably want to build some projects on public lands. So, gosh, if this terrible, sinister language in this bill would shut down all human activity on public lands, create a no man's land where no one could ever go, no one could ever do anything, and all the other absurdities that we heard from Mr. Stein, you probably would oppose that language, but I hear you here today supporting that language. You want to explain why?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman. I am here supporting this bill because, it is important to, while we need to look at the greenhouse gas impacts of all energy generation and all activity, I think what this bill is really asking for is a balanced approach, right? And just understanding what the impacts are and making informed decisions based on data and based on science. And we think that solar energy is a critical piece of the solution set for the climate crisis, and the production and the build and the installation of solar panels is an activity that is appropriate, and the benefits that we would get, the climate benefits we would get, are vastly outweigh any greenhouse gas implications of the build. So we think it's important to do, and we would love to build more on public lands.
Thank you. Mr. Stein, I'm going to just ask you a yes or no question. You must be familiar with the IPCC's reporting telling us that there is a climate crisis caused by primarily the human burning of fossil fuels, and that we have a very limited time to fundamentally and rapidly change course and decarbonize the global economy. Do you agree with that consensus from the IPCC or not? It's a yes or no question.
That's not what the IPCC says. It does not say that there is a climate crisis. You will not find that in the IPCC.
Okay. Do you believe there is a climate crisis?
That is not a scientific statement. A climate crisis. No, absolutely not.
That's fascinating
to hear.
It's not a scientific statement. So do you believe there is a climate crisis?
No, I do not. It is
Okay.
not a crisis. The Earth is not becoming uninhabitable, and it will not become uninhabitable. Even the worst case scenarios don't indicate an uninhabitable
This is
Earth
wonderful.
that you were referring
So
to.
to hear this in its fullest form, do you believe it's just fine to be on track for 2 degrees Celsius or greater warming by mid-century, end of the century? All that's just fine?
I think humanity is more than capable of adapting to that warming, yes.
Well, let us welcome the true expression of climate denial that sometimes our Republican friends like to say they've evolved beyond.
It's funny
still alive
that
and
you
well.
making extreme
Thank you,
statements
Mr.
in
Stein.
the alarmist direction is not denial. That's interesting to me. You're just as extreme on the other side.
Representative Huffman, your time has exceeded. Thank you for your questions. I now recognize Representative Tiffany for 5 minutes of questions.
Hard act to follow, but thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Autungaruk, for fiscal year 2021, oil and gas property taxes accounted for approximately 95% of the North Slope Borough's total property tax revenue for essential services. Is that accurate? Is that number correct?
That's a borough number. We would have to communicate with the borough. I assume that that was formulated with their efforts.
But is it correct that oil and gas property taxes provide most of the budget for essential services up on the North Slope?
Yes, the state of Alaska and North Slope are very reliant on oil and gas development.
And then the Willow project would provide additional services, is that right? Or additional monies towards those services, wastewater, drinking water, those type of things. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Doctor. I appreciate those answers. Just like to comment, I don't know if you all remember Copernicus. Copernicus advanced the theory that the world was round, that Earth was round. He was excommunicated from the Catholic Church, who was the arbiter of truth at that point back, what was that, 500-600 years ago, something like that. When you say science is consensus, science is not consensus. It's a little bit like Dr. Fauci saying, I'm science. And science is not consensus. Just go back to Copernicus, who stood against the wind and said, yes, the world is round. And he stood against all the leading scientists at that time. Dr. Dessler, why has Europe failed? They are having an incredible energy crisis at this point. They did the big conversion, much like California is doing now, and they're having skyrocketing energy prices. They don't know how, some people are questioning whether they're going to be able to heat their homes. Why have they failed when they've went to renewables as...
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So the problem is the Ukrainian war. So they're relying on Russian...
Okay.
Can I finish the answer? This is, Ukrainian war is a fossil-fueled war. Putin invaded because he didn't think people would respond because he knew he had their hands around their necks. And that's the problem with using fossil fuels.
Sure, but the problem started before then. If you go to England, where they also have made this so-called transition, this started before the invasion of the Ukraine.
Okay, so if you go back in time...
So I want to ask another question here, Dr. Dessler.
I'd be happy to respond to that point, though.
I appreciate it.
Maybe someone else will ask me that question.
For Ms. Hopper, one of the #1 killers of endangered species and threatened species at this point is solar panels and wind turbines. Is there anything being done about that by the industry?
Yes, we actually our C3 just released a report today about the cohabitation and the ways in which solar panels, in particular, I can't speak to the wind, the solar industry is mitigating. There's a lot of work being done, and I think it's based on some of the science and the data that we spoke about earlier.
Because didn't they, I remember I hope I pronounced this word right, the Ivanpah project out in California, they talked about, I think they called them flamers, is that right? Where birds fly into a solar array and they get fried. Is that still happening?
So that, I believe, was a concentrated solar power project. That is not the technology widely used in the United States today. That represents a very tiny percentage of solar. So I think it's a different, it was a different issue then, but we certainly remain committed to building and maintaining environmentally sensitive and responsible projects.
Just like you're committed not to get solar panels from China, but we continue to get them. I'm going to close with this.
We do actually get a lot of solar panels from China if you look at our imports.
I've only got about 30 seconds left. So let's listen to what the previous questioner, he said, we have this decade, or we're going to see the end of the world as we know it. Remember, back in 1975, the cover of Newsweek and Time, it said global cooling is going to end the world. We are, as we know it, we are going to see mass global starvation by the year 2000 as a result of global cooling. Now it is global warming. We have a former vice president who said the polar ice cap on the North Pole polar ice cap will be gone. He said that in 2009. He said by 2013. We continue to see this the sky is falling attitude, and the American people, they see through it. I'm going to yield back. I wish I had a lot more time to ask questions of the witnesses that are here, but I'll have to yield back.
Thank you, Representative Tiffany. I believe there are no other members present at this moment, so I'm going to conclude by recognizing myself.
Hey, Mr. Chair, we do have Chair Grijalva here too, just so you know.
Grijalva, I'm going to recognize you for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you and the ranking member for the hearing on this bill. And the motivation behind the bill is exactly what other members said earlier in their questioning. It is about accepting a fundamental reality. It is accepting the reality that we're near public lands and waters are a quarter of the contributors to carbon emissions and greenhouse gas. And the reverse of that is we can be a quarter of the domestic solution and in beginning to turn that and to reach Biden's goals. The intent of the legislation that we're discussing this morning is pretty simple to me. Mandating the Interior Department to have a responsibility to the public to demonstrate whether fossil fuel development on U.S. public lands and waters is undermining the country's climate goals. If the department determines that more fuel fossil leasing and permitting will prevent the U.S. from meeting our emissions targets, then we should not be expanding coal, oil, or gas development. I really do think that's it. It's that simple. And, that's the approach of the legislation. Because with all due respect to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, my Republican colleagues, we've gone through various issues. Throwing the word extremist around has become convenient lately in our dialogues, but nevertheless, we've gone around, since I've been on this committee, on the issue of climate change. First, outright denial by my Republican, it doesn't exist. Watch the snow melt in my hand, analogies, and then we move on. Then there was just simply ignore it. We have the power right now, we have a majority here or there, and let's just ignore it. Then it became about avoidance. But like it or not, the overwhelming, conclusive, and realistic, and fact-based, empirical information about the state of our climate and this world is that we have to do something about it. So what's the next strategy that comes along? Delay. Can't do it now. Gas is too high. Can't do anything now. Need to wait for China, India, the developing world, and the poor countries in the third world to have stringent standards themselves. We shouldn't do anything until that happens. We should be exporting, and that way we create a basis for creating and strengthening NATO and national security. Those are not facts. That's political commentary. The reality is that we're going to go through a transition in this country, Mr. Chairman. And let me ask two of the witnesses, Dr. Dressler, this transition, we can either move in the direction that this legislation addresses with discussion and compromise at some level, or we can continue to delay and ignore. And then there's going to be a transition. There could be a transition that we time and have some control and some investment in, or it could be a transition in which we leave the majority of the American people behind to see how they survive while we go forward. Because science tells us, instinct tells us, time tells us that that's the direction that we're going. Could you speak to those two? And which is the most devastating to this economy of ours? Take a present snapshot or a future snapshot of that economy. If the transition is sharp and painful, or the transition is this one that talks about study, planning, management going forward.
Right. So we have a lot of experience that abrupt transitions are bad. And I do think that I agree with you that there will be a transition to renewable energy occurring at some point because the impacts of climate change will simply not be acceptable to people. And the price of renewable energy will continue to drop and continue to drop. In fact, we see the transition happening today, just not.
Let me ask, if I ask, because I wanted to ask Ms. Hooper. Yes. Is there an even playing field between on public lands and waters and the development and analysis and the development of alternative renewable energy and the fossil fuel industry and their practice on public lands and waters? Are we talking about an even playing field or a disadvantage advantage?
No, we do not have an even playing field. They're much well-resourced, much better staffed, much more historical competency in the agencies, and much more land available for development.
We've subsidized the fossil fuel industry for decades upon decades in this country on our public lands, and with minimal royalties, minimal consequences, no cleanup, no mitigation. And I think it's time that we looked at making an investment in the transitions that's going to occur, whether people like it or not. I just want to be at the forefront to be able to say that transition needs to be fair, and it can't leave the majority of the American people behind while those that can afford it take care of themselves. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the indulgence.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Grijalva. I want to clarify something and understand from the testimony. I want to ask Dr. Dessler, would you like to respond to Mr. Stein's assertion that there is no climate crisis?
Well, what the science clearly shows us is that the Earth is warming, humans are to blame for the warming, and the magnitude of future warming is going to be extremely large. And the economists who look at that tell us that the cost of that could be extremely excessive. And I would also point out that to the statement that Mr. Stein made that we can adapt, there is an enormous amount of suffering embedded in that statement. If you look at what adaptation really means, it means one of two things. Either the government is going to have to pay to help people adapt, higher taxes, but of course that's not what the people who say let's adapt support. They just support throwing those people to the wolves. I mean, who's going to pay to install air conditioning for people for cities that need air conditioning? That's extremely expensive. And adaptation, it means let's let people suffer. It's exactly the same kind of normalizing suffering that we did during COVID. During COVID, people started dying. It's like, oh, that's too bad. That person is, it's exactly that. And it's going to be exactly the same thing. Oh, these people are suffering. Oh, what you going to do? We're going to normalize suffering. And I think that, it's a response that if people actually looked at what the science tells us, they would not accept.
Dr. Dessler, another question. The Biden administration has set aggressive but necessary emission reduction targets, including a 50 to 52% reduction in emissions by from 2005 levels, by 2030, a net zero economy no later than 2050. In your view, are these targets supported by science? And what are the potential consequences if we don't reduce our emissions in line with these targets?
So the world has agreed to aim for targets of well below 2 degrees Celsius with aspirational goals to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius in the Paris Agreement. I think those targets are consistent with those goals. Those goals are compromises between people who want lower goals and people who don't want such high goals. But the consequences of exceeding that could be dire. As I said in my testimony, economists have no idea what the cost of this is going to be. And it's easy to say, we'll adapt. But in fact, we don't know that that's true. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. And since we have an alternative, renewable energy, which is now our cheapest energy, let me just emphasize that, and we could easily, at virtually no cost, switch to a grid that is primarily an electrical grid, and we can talk about non-electrical sources if you want. But we can solve this problem. So I think that these targets are certainly reasonable, and they're consistent with what the world has agreed to for climate targets.
Thank you, Dr. Dessler. I'd like to make some, after listening to the discussion today, I want to say that, and I want to return to what's in HR 8802. This bill does not actually shut down all fossil fuel extractions on public lands and waters indefinitely. It's true that once the bill becomes law, there's going to be a pause on issuing fossil fuel permits and holding fossil fuel lease sales. However, the purpose of that is to give the Interior Department and the Forest Service time to develop a strategy and to analyze whether continued fossil fuel development prevents the U.S. from achieving our emission reduction goals, which you've just heard from Dr. Dessler, that are reasonable. The two agencies and their leadership will be responsible for conducting a fair and thorough analysis. Section 4 of the bill spells out the requirements for this strategy. Once the strategy is published, and if it finds that continued leasing and permitting are consistent with the Biden administration's target goals, the Interior Department is free to continue to issue drilling permits and hold fossil fuel leases. This is what the Republicans have been asking for in terms of an energy. How do we get there? What is Interior's energy plan? This lays it out, and I'm going to yield back. Thank you. With that,
Hey, Mr. Chair, before you close it, may I have 1 minute?
Yes, you may.
Yeah. Mr. Chair, I wanted to thank you. If this is going to be our last meeting as Subcommittee Energy and Minerals Resources, I want to thank you for your leadership and your fairness at these hearings. We are going to miss your leadership, but on a personal level, I'm going to miss our friendship. And I want you to know that, and I wanted to state that once again publicly. And California is going to miss a great representative, and I yield back.
Well, I thank you, Representative Staubach. It's very kind of you. But with that, I'd like to say if I can find my notes on it, or else we're going to sit here for a while. But, we're not. We're going to conclude this witness panel. First, are there any members who have not had their 5 minutes, who I did not call upon, and who seek recognition to ask questions now? Then I think I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of this committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we'll ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there's no further business, without objection, this subcommittee stands adjourned.
Thank you, everyone.